The accession of Richard II. Richard II became King of England at a very young age, ascending the throne at just 10 years old after the death of his grandfather, King Edward III. Richard was immediately thrown into the turbulent world of politics, ruling over a kingdom with both internal and external challenges. His early reign marked a period of uncertainty, both for the young king and the kingdom at large. Although Richard's succession to the throne appeared smooth on the surface, the reality of ruling at such a tender age proved far more complicated. With the king so young, power was largely in the hands of his advisors, particularly his uncle, John of Gaunt, and the regency. In theory, the kingdom was governed by these experienced individuals, but in practice, they did much more than simply assist the boy king. They controlled much of the political landscape. For Richard, his youth became both an asset and a liability. As a child, he was seen as a symbol of hope and potential for the future of England. The kingdom was in need of stability after the long reign of his grandfather, and Richard represented a new beginning. However, Richard's inability to actively participate in governance meant that his authority was fragile, and he lacked the political experience necessary to steer the kingdom through turbulent times. In the early days of his reign, Richard had little direct involvement in the day-to-day affairs of the state. Instead, power was wielded by a series of regents and influential nobles who would use the young king's name to further their own ambitions. The crown's authority rested on their shoulders, leaving Richard in the shadow of their decisions. The future king, despite being the monarch, had little say in the direction of the country. This imbalance of power would prove to be a double-edged sword as Richard matured. The early period of Richard's reign, while marked by relative peace, also sowed the seeds of discontent. The nobles who held power over the young king saw their influence grow, while Richard himself, though officially in charge, had little practical control. This would lead to the first signs of tension between the monarchy and the nobility, and between Richard and the growing ambitions of those who served him. Thus, Richard II's ascent to the throne was not just a story of a young king taking the crown. It was a tale of power dynamics, the complexities of a boy king's authority, and the heavy influence of those who controlled the levers of power in a kingdom teetering on the edge of change. The influence of the nobles. In the early years of his reign, Richard II was heavily influenced by the nobles and advisors who surrounded him. With such a young king on the throne, it was inevitable that power would be wielded by those who were older, wiser, and more experienced in governance. The most prominent of these figures was Richard's uncle, John of Gaunt, who held significant sway over both Richard and the English court. Although Richard officially held the title of king, it was often Gaunt and others like him who made the real decisions behind the scenes. At first, Richard's reliance on his advisors seemed to be a necessary step for a child king. With the kingdom in a delicate state, it was assumed that the guidance of trusted individuals would stabilize the nation. However, as time passed, Richard's dependence on these advisors grew. He began to lose his sense of self-reliance, and power slowly slipped from his grasp. Instead of growing into a strong, independent monarch, Richard became a puppet king, his strings pulled by those who had their own agendas. The influence of the nobles extended beyond the court and into the very heart of the government. The young king was caught in a web of conflicting interests, each noble seeking to gain favor with Richard and ensure that their faction had the upper hand. This created a volatile atmosphere, as Richard was unable to control the shifting power dynamics and often found himself at odds with the very men who held sway over him. The nobles, in turn, played a dangerous game, using Richard's inexperience to further their own political goals. It is important to note that while Richard may have appeared to be a weak ruler, his early reign also revealed a king with potential. He was bright, eager to learn, and showed a capacity for leadership that, if properly nurtured, could have made him a formidable monarch. However, his inability to assert himself and challenge the authority of his advisors left him vulnerable to manipulation. The more Richard relied on his nobles, the more power they accumulated, and the more he lost control of his own kingdom. The lesson here is that a ruler must have a strong sense of autonomy and self-confidence to lead effectively. While advisors and trusted individuals are necessary, a king or leader cannot afford to be entirely reliant on others, as it undermines their ability to make independent decisions. In Richard's case, his early failure to establish his authority would come back to haunt him later in his reign, as he would struggle to regain the power he had unwittingly ceded to those around him. The growing influence of the nobles in Richard II's reign not only weakened his authority, but it also set the stage for the political instability that would define his rule. With each passing year, Richard's power became more diluted, and his reliance on his advisors became his greatest vulnerability. The early political mistakes. As Richard II grew older, his reign became marked by a series of political missteps that would have lasting consequences. Despite his initial potential, his failure to assert his authority and make independent decisions had left him vulnerable to the influence of those around him. Over time, Richard's inability to manage his relationships with the nobility and his advisors would result in growing discontent within the kingdom, eventually leading to his downfall. One of the first major mistakes Richard made was his decision to become more involved in the governance of the kingdom, but without the proper political acumen or guidance. Although he had been heavily influenced by his advisors in the early years, Richard attempted to take a more hands-on approach in later years. However, lacking the wisdom and experience required, he often alienated his most important allies by making rash decisions that failed to take into account the interests of the nobility. This created growing frustration among the powerful lords, who felt that their influence was being undermined. Richard's attempts to centralize power were met with resistance from the very individuals who had once supported him. He sought to reduce the influence of the nobles and increase his personal authority, but this move was perceived as an attack on the traditional power structures of the English court. The nobles, who had grown accustomed to holding significant sway in the kingdom, began to view Richard's actions as an act of defiance. In retaliation, they sought to undermine his authority at every turn, using their power and influence to manipulate the political landscape to their advantage. The tension between Richard and his nobles grew to a boiling point when he tried to bypass the traditional checks on his power, such as the Parliament and his council. By attempting to bypass the system, Richard not only alienated the nobles, but also risked upsetting the balance of power that had long existed in England. The king's attempts to centralize power ultimately led to greater resistance, and the nobles began to unite against him. In addition to his strained relationships with the nobility, Richard also failed to properly manage his relationship with the common people. The high taxes imposed to fund various wars and projects alienated the lower classes, and Richard's attempts to use force to suppress any dissent only worsened the situation. The economic hardships faced by the commoners were compounded by the growing tension between the monarchy and the nobility, creating a perfect storm of discontent that would eventually erupt in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The political mistakes made during this period were a reflection of Richard's inability to balance the interests of the various factions within his kingdom. His failure to recognize the importance of alliances, the necessity of diplomacy, and the role of the nobility in governance ultimately undermined his authority. As the political landscape became more fractured, Richard lost the support of the very people he needed to maintain his power. The lesson from this chapter is clear. A ruler must understand the delicate balance of power within their kingdom and act with caution when making decisions that could upset the existing order. Overreaching for power without considering the consequences can lead to alienation and ultimately to the loss of that power. Richard's inability to manage the political landscape of his time led to his downfall and serves as a cautionary tale for all leaders. Early years under the influence of advisors. As Richard II's reign progressed, the influence of his advisors grew stronger and his personal role in governance became more limited. In the early years, Richard had been a young child, relying heavily on regents and experienced nobles like his uncle John of Gaunt to govern on his behalf. While this was expected for a boy king, it became clear over time that Richard's reliance on others was not helping him grow into the strong monarch he needed to be. Instead of developing a sense of independence, John of Gaunt was a prominent figure in Richard's early reign, holding significant power both in England and within the royal court. Gaunt was a skilled and experienced politician, and his guidance was pivotal in the years following Richard's accession. However, the more Richard deferred to Gaunt and other influential figures, the more control he lost over his own kingdom. Richard became more of a symbolic figurehead than an active ruler. The nobles around Richard saw his youth and inexperience as an opportunity to shape the kingdom to suit their own interests. They exploited Richard's dependence on them and used it to expand their own power, undermining the king's authority. As Richard grew older, his attempts to assert himself were met with resistance from the very people he relied on. Instead of guiding the young king towards independence, his advisors began to dominate the political scene, further weakening Richard's position. During this period, Richard had little opportunity to build his own political network. His reliance on the nobility meant that he lacked the experience and connections needed to assert his authority in the court. Although he had shown early potential as a ruler, the political dynamics of the court kept him from realizing this potential. His advisors, while influential, also had their own ambitions, and Richard became a pawn in their political games, unable to break free from their control. Richard's early years under the influence of his advisors set the stage for the growing power struggles that would later define his reign. The lessons learned during this period shaped the way Richard would approach governance in the years to come. Unfortunately, his failure to assert himself early on would ultimately lead to the erosion of his power and the eventual collapse of his reign. The lesson from this chapter is that leadership requires more than simply deferring to others. A king, or any leader, must cultivate independence and gain the experience necessary to make their own decisions. While advisors are essential, they should not become the ones pulling all the strings. Richard's failure to navigate this balance early in his reign set him on a path toward decline, showing that reliance on others can lead to the loss of one's authority and control. Struggles with power and authority. As Richard II entered his late teens and early 20s, his attempts to seize control of the kingdom were met with growing opposition. He had spent his formative years in the shadow of his advisors, and although he had now reached adulthood, his lack of political experience and the grip that the nobility held on the kingdom made it difficult for him to assert his own authority. This struggle with power and authority became one of the defining themes of Richard's reign. Richard's first major attempt at asserting his independence came in the form of a series of decisions that were seen as an affront to the established power structure of the English court. He attempted to weaken the influence of his regents and advisors, making decisions without consulting them or seeking their approval. His actions alienated many of his key supporters, especially the nobles who had long been accustomed to wielding power behind the throne. These nobles, including powerful figures like Melevert. The growing tension between Richard and his nobles reached a boiling point when he sought to assert more direct control over military affairs. His attempt to centralize authority and take command of the army was met with resistance from both his advisors and the nobility. Richard's failure to navigate this power struggle left him vulnerable, as the very people who had helped him ascend to the throne now saw him as a threat to their own power and influence. Richard's efforts to strengthen his position were further complicated by his inability to balance the competing interests of the different factions within the court. While he sought to secure his position by curbing the power of the nobles, he also struggled to maintain the support of the common people. His high-handed approach to governance alienated the very groups that he needed to secure his rule. He imposed heavy taxes to fund his military campaigns, which only further fueled discontent among the commoners. In addition, Richard's actions during this time showed a lack of political foresight. His attempts to centralize power and bypass the traditional structures of government created a situation where he was seen as either ineffectively weak or dangerously authoritarian, depending on which faction you spoke to. His failure to strike a balance between consolidating his own power and maintaining the traditional roles of the nobility and other political structures only served to erode his own authority. The lesson from this chapter is clear. A ruler cannot simply impose authority without understanding the balance of power within the kingdom. Leadership is about diplomacy, understanding the needs of the different factions, and maintaining the support of both the elite and the common people. Richard's struggle with power and authority during this period ultimately weakened his position and laid the groundwork for his downfall. The growing tension with the nobles. As Richard II's reign progressed, the relationship between him and the nobility continued to deteriorate. The growing tension between the king and his advisors was not just a product of political maneuvering. It reflected a deeper rift between the monarchy and the established power structures of the kingdom. Richard's desire for greater control and autonomy clashed directly with the nobles who had become accustomed to wielding significant influence over the king. The nobles saw Richard's attempts to reduce the power of the nobility were increasingly seen as a threat to their own positions. The king's decisions, especially those involving key positions within the government and military, began to alienate the very people who had helped establish his reign. The nobles began to question Richard's authority and his ability to lead. They saw his actions as signs of weakness and inexperience, rather than strength and resolve. The rift between Richard and his nobles came to a head when Richard attempted to bypass the traditional system of government by sidelining the council and parliament. These moves were seen as an outright challenge to the authority of the nobles and the long-standing political order of the kingdom. By trying to consolidate power and act independently of his advisors, Richard inadvertently united the various factions of the nobility against him. Richard's failure to understand the delicate balance of power in his court only deepened the tensions. While he sought to impose his own vision for the future of England, he did not recognize the need for compromise and negotiation. Instead of working with the nobles to find a mutually agreeable path forward, Richard attempted to impose his will, which only resulted in further alienation. The nobles, who had long enjoyed the privilege of advising the monarch and controlling many aspects of governance, now saw Richard's actions as a betrayal. His attempts to centralize power at the expense of their influence led to a growing sense of resentment. This resentment, fueled by Richard's authoritarian style of governance, eventually contributed to the political instability that would define the rest of his reign. The lesson from this chapter is the importance of maintaining balance in governance. A leader cannot afford to alienate their key allies, especially when those allies hold significant power. By disregarding the influence of the nobility and overstepping his bounds, Richard created an environment of distrust and rebellion. This set the stage for the eventual downfall of his reign, as the nobles united to challenge his authority and remove him from power. In the end, Richard's inability to navigate the complex dynamics of the English court left him vulnerable to those who sought to replace him. The tension with the nobles was a critical factor in the collapse of his authority, and it serves as a powerful reminder that political leaders must always be mindful of the balance of power in their kingdoms. The outbreak of the Peasants' Revolt. The growing tensions between Richard II and his nobles were not the only source of unrest during his reign. The common people, burdened by heavy taxes and economic hardship, had begun to grow dissatisfied with the king's rule. In 1381, this dissatisfaction reached a boiling point when the peasants' revolt erupted. This was a significant event in Richard's reign, one that would have far-reaching consequences for both his authority and the stability of the kingdom. The revolt began as a response to a series of harsh tax measures, including the infamous poll tax, which was perceived as unfairly targeting the poorest members of society. The peasants, already struggling with poverty, were outraged by the imposition of such a heavy tax, and their anger was further fueled by the economic hardships caused by the ongoing wars and the plague that had ravaged England in previous years. The revolt quickly spread across the south and east of England, as peasants and common folk rose up against their lords and the ruling class. The insurgents, led by figures such as Wat Tyler and John Ball, marched on London, demanding that the king address their grievances and end the oppressive taxation. The revolt was not merely a protest against taxation, it was a direct challenge to the existing social order. The peasants sought to dismantle the feudal system that had long kept them in poverty and servitude. For Richard II, the peasants' revolt was a defining moment in his reign. The king, who had long been seen as a figurehead, with little control over the affairs of the kingdom, was faced with a genuine crisis that threatened his authority. The revolt was a direct challenge not only to his policies, but to the very foundations of the monarchy and the social order in England. Richard's response to the revolt would shape his legacy. He chose to meet with the leaders of the revolt, including Wat Tyler, and promised to address their concerns. However, this negotiation process was fraught with tension, and the king's actions were seen as weak by both the rebels and his own nobles. While Richard did make some concessions, such as agreeing to abolish the poll tax, he was unable to fully quell the anger of the insurgents, and the rebellion continued to spread. The peasants' revolt was ultimately crushed by the king's forces, but it left a lasting mark on Richard's reign. The events of 1381 revealed the deep divides in English society and the fragile nature of the monarchy. Richard's inability to effectively manage the situation demonstrated his lack of political skill and his failure to understand the needs and frustrations of the common people. The lesson from this chapter is that a ruler must always be aware of the needs of the people and the potential for unrest. Economic inequality, harsh taxation, and social injustice can lead to rebellion if left unchecked. Richard's failure to prevent the peasants' revolt and his weak response to the crisis contributed to the erosion of his power and the eventual downfall of his reign. Richard's response to the revolt. The peasants' revolt of 1381 presented a significant challenge to Richard II's rule, forcing him to make critical decisions that would define his leadership. Richard, still a young king, found himself caught between the demands of the rebels and the pressures of his advisors and nobles, all of whom had their own interests to protect. The king's response to the revolt was marked by indecision and weakness, and his actions would come to haunt him in the years to follow. In the early stages of the revolt, Richard sought to quell the anger of the rebels by engaging in negotiations. He met with the leaders of the revolt, including Wat Tyler, a charismatic and outspoken figure who became the face of the insurgency. Richard's willingness to meet with the rebels and listen to their grievances was seen by some as a sign of strength, as he appeared to show compassion for the suffering of his people. However, this approach also revealed the king's lack of political experience and his inability to assert his authority. Richard's negotiations with the rebels were problematic from the start. While he promised to meet some of their demands, including the abolition of the poll tax, he failed to recognize the larger issues at play. The rebellion was not just about taxes. It was a reaction to deep-seated social and economic inequalities that had existed for centuries. Richard's inability to address these root causes left the rebels unsatisfied, and as the talks progressed, tensions between the king and the insurgents escalated. The turning point came when Wat Tyler, the leader of the rebels, was killed in a skirmish with Richard's forces. This event marked the collapse of the rebellion's leadership and left the peasants without a clear direction. Richard, seeing an opportunity to restore order, famously rode out to meet the rebels and gave a speech in which he promised to protect them and ensure their safety. This moment, while meant to show the king's authority and compassion, only further alienated the nobles and advisors who saw it as a sign of weakness. After Tyler's death, the rebellion quickly disbanded, and Richard's forces were able to restore order. However, the damage had been done. Richard had failed to fully understand the complexities of the revolt, and his weak response had undermined his authority. Although the king made some concessions to the peasants, including the abolition of the poll tax and the promise of other reforms, these measures were not enough to prevent further unrest. The aftermath of the revolt left Richard with little political capital and even less support among his nobles. The lesson from this chapter is clear. A leader must respond decisively to threats to their authority. Negotiation and diplomacy can be effective tools, but only when combined with a strong sense of control and the ability to back up promises with concrete actions. Richard's inability to strike this balance during the peasants' revolt exposed his weakness as a ruler and contributed to the erosion of his power. By failing to address the core issues of the rebellion, and by showing weakness in the face of rebellion, Richard set the stage for further challenges to his rule. The long-term consequences of the revolt. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 may have been crushed in the immediate aftermath, but its long-term consequences had a profound impact on the reign of Richard II. While Richard managed to regain control of the kingdom in the short term, the rebellion highlighted deep divisions within English society, and it exposed the fragile nature of the monarchy. The consequences of Richard's response to the revolt and the unrest it caused would reverberate throughout his reign and contribute to his eventual downfall. One of the immediate effects of the revolt was a decline in Richard's popularity. While the rebels may have been defeated, their demands for social and economic reform resonated with many of the common people who had been suffering under harsh taxes and the feudal system for generations. Richard's failure to address the underlying causes of the rebellion only fueled discontent among the lower classes, who began to view the king as weak and out of touch with their needs. In the wake of the revolt, Richard faced increasing pressure from both the nobles and the common people. His authority was already tenuous, and the failure to quell the rebellion fully eroded what little support he had left. The nobles, who had initially backed Richard's efforts to suppress the revolt, became more distrustful of the king. They saw his concessions to the peasants as signs of weakness, and they began to question his ability to rule effectively. Richard's attempts to restore order to the kingdom were met with skepticism. He made some attempts to ease tensions by promising reforms, but his efforts were half-hearted and lacked the necessary political backing. The nobles, seeing an opportunity to regain their lost influence, began to assert themselves more aggressively, further undermining Richard's authority. The king found himself caught in a vicious cycle of promises that he could not fulfill, and political factions that could not be appeased. The long-term consequences of the Peasants' Revolt were not just political, they were also social and economic. The rebellion exposed the deep-seated resentment of the lower classes towards the feudal system. And although Richard made some efforts to reform, the changes were not enough to quell the anger that had been building for years. The social divisions that had led to the revolt persisted, and the discontent among the peasants and common folk would continue to fester throughout Richard's reign. In addition, the revolt revealed the vulnerability of the monarchy, Richard's inability to effectively manage the crisis, and his weak response to the demands of the rebels demonstrated his lack of political skill. It became clear that Richard's leadership was fragile, and this perception would continue to undermine his authority as his reign progressed. The lesson from this chapter is that failing to address the root causes of social unrest can have far-reaching consequences. While Richard may have suppressed the peasants' revolt in the short term, he failed to address the deeper issues of inequality and injustice that led to the rebellion. His inability to provide real solutions left the kingdom vulnerable to future unrest and contributed to the decline of his rule. Henry Bolingbroke's return. The peasants' revolt was not the only threat to Richard II's reign, but it was certainly a defining moment that exposed his vulnerabilities. As Richard struggled with political instability and growing dissatisfaction within the kingdom, a more personal threat to his authority emerged. The return of Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt, marked the beginning of the end for Richard II's reign. Bolingbroke's return to England was driven by his desire to reclaim his inheritance and assert his... Henry Bolingbroke's exile was a result of political infighting between Richard and his nobles. Bolingbroke, who had been exiled by Richard, returned in 1399 with the support of a large number of influential nobles who were dissatisfied with Richard's rule. Bolingbroke's return was not just a personal matter, it was a political movement that aimed to challenge Richard's authority. Bolingbroke, sensing the growing discontent within the kingdom, was able to rally support from both the nobles and the cautionary. Bolingbroke's actions were both strategic and calculated. He returned to England, claiming that he was merely seeking to reclaim his inheritance, which had been unjustly taken from him. This was a familiar political maneuver in medieval England, where many nobles used claims of injustice as a pretext to challenge the king. Bolingbroke, however, was not just seeking personal revenge. He was also leveraging the growing dissatisfaction with Richard's rule to gain political support and legitimacy. Richard, who had already been struggling with the nobles' discontent, found himself in a difficult position. His failure to manage his relationships with the powerful nobles, combined with the growing unrest among the common people, made it impossible for him to resist Bolingbroke's return. The king, despite having the formal authority of the throne, lacked the political support and military strength to effectively confront Bolingbroke. The nobles, who had once supported Richard, began to see Bolingbroke as a better alternative. The rising tensions within the court and the kingdom had left Richard isolated, and many of his former allies began to pledge their allegiance to Bolingbroke. With support from a significant portion of the nobility, Bolingbroke marched toward London, and Richard was forced to confront the reality that his reign was in jeopardy. The return of Bolingbroke marked the beginning of a political crisis that would ultimately result in Richard II's downfall. Bolingbroke's political savvy and his ability to exploit the weaknesses of Richard's rule allowed him to gain traction quickly. What began as a personal grievance soon turned into a full-fledged political movement that threatened to unseat the king. The lesson from this chapter is that a ruler must always be aware of the political dynamics within their kingdom. Bolingbroke's return and the support he garnered from the nobility were not just the result of a personal vendetta. They were a reflection of Richard's failure to maintain control over the powerful factions in his court. A ruler must ensure that their relationships with key figures remain strong and that they are able to manage the complex web of political allegiances that defines their rule. The fall of Richard II. Richard II's reign, which began with the promise of youthful energy and ambition, ended in a dramatic and ultimately tragic fall from power. The return of Henry Bolingbroke in 1399 marked the beginning of the end for Richard. The political chaos and the lack of support from both the nobles and the common people made it impossible for Richard to retain the throne. As Bolingbroke's army marched toward London, Richard found himself in an increasingly desperate situation, facing the inevitable loss. When Bolingbroke arrived in London, he quickly gained the support of many of Richard's key allies, including influential nobles who had once been loyal to the king. These nobles, seeing the growing discontent and uncertainty surrounding Richard, began to see Bolingbroke as a more stable and legitimate alternative. Richard, by contrast, was seen as weak, indecisive, and unable to manage the political landscape of his kingdom. The support for Bolingbroke grew rapidly, and Richard's position became increasingly precarious. Richard's attempts to resist were futile. He had been so out of touch with the political realities of his court and kingdom that he failed to rally sufficient support when Bolingbroke returned. By the time Richard attempted to confront Bolingbroke, he had already lost the support of the key factions within his court. Bolingbroke's forces advanced on London with minimal resistance, and Richard was forced to surrender. The once powerful king, whose reign had begun with such promise, was now a prisoner in his own kingdom. After his capture, Richard was held in confinement at the Tower of London, where he was eventually forced to abdicate in favour of Henry Bolingbroke. Bolingbroke, now Henry IV, took the throne, marking the official end of Richard II's reign. Richard's fall from power was a reflection of his inability to manage the political dynamics of his court and his failure to maintain the support of both the nobility and the common people. In the aftermath of his abdication, Richard II's fate was sealed. Although he was initially promised a life of relative comfort in captivity, Richard's imprisonment marked the final act of his tragic downfall. Reports vary about the exact cause of his death, with some suggesting that he was murdered while in custody. Regardless of the cause, Richard II's death marked the end of a once promising reign, and his downfall became a cautionary tale for future monarchs about the importance of maintaining political support and balance. The lesson from this chapter is that a ruler's reign is only as strong as the support they can maintain. Richard's inability to adapt to the changing political landscape, his failure to address the grievances of his nobles and people, and his failure to consolidate his power ultimately led to his downfall. The rise of Bolingbroke and the collapse of Richard's reign serve as a reminder of the fragile nature of political power and the importance of staying connected to both the elite and the common folk. The aftermath of Richard's fall. The deposition of Richard II in 1399 was not just a personal tragedy for the king, but also a pivotal moment in English history. His fall from power ushered in a new era of political instability, with Henry IV now occupying the throne. While Bolingbroke's rise was seen as a victory by some, it was far from a clear and uncontroversial triumph. The events that followed Richard's deposition would sow the seeds for decades of conflict and turmoil within the kingdom. Richard's abdication was forced upon him by the political realities of the time. Once he had lost the support of the nobles, it was inevitable that he would be removed from the throne. The nobles, who had played such a crucial role in shaping Richard's reign, were now the ones who chose to replace him with Bolingbroke. Richard, however, did not fade quietly into the background. His imprisonment at the Tower of London was a symbol of his fall from grace, and it marked the beginning of a new chapter in English policy. For Bolingbroke, the victory was bittersweet. While he had gained the throne, the manner in which he had done so, by removing Richard II, left a bitter taste. His ascent to power was seen by some as a usurpation, and his rule was not universally accepted by all factions within the nobility. The legitimacy of Henry IV's reign would be questioned by those who remained loyal to Richard II, leading to internal strife and challenges to his authority. Richard II's fall also had profound consequences for the monarchy itself. The events of 1399 marked a turning point in the relationship between the king and the nobility. Richard's failure to maintain control over his court and the loss of his authority to Bolingbroke represented a shift in the balance of power. The king's ability to rule through divine right and the traditional structures of power were now in question. The subsequent Wars of the Roses, which would break out a few decades later, were a direct consequence. The aftermath of Richard's reign saw a weakening of the central monarchy. Bolingbroke's rise to the throne did not restore the monarchy's stability. Instead, it opened the door for greater noble influence and power struggles within the court. Richard's inability to maintain his authority had left the monarchy vulnerable, and his fall served as a reminder that power, once lost, is difficult to regain. The lesson from this chapter is clear. A ruler must maintain control over the key political factions in their kingdom. A monarch cannot afford to lose the support of their nobles, as this will inevitably lead to their downfall. Richard's failure to balance the needs and interests of the different factions, his lack of political acumen, and his inability to assert his authority ultimately led to the loss of his throne. The events following Richard's fall were a testament to the fragile nature of monarchical power. Reflection on Richard's reign. The reign of Richard II is often remembered as one filled with promise and potential, yet ultimately marked by failure and downfall. Richard's early years as king were characterized by political instability, personal inexperience, and an inability to assert his authority. While he began his reign as a symbol of hope for England's future, his actions over the years led to his decline, showing the fragile nature of power and the devastating consequences of mismanagement. Richard's reign began with high expectations. As a young king, he represented a new generation of rulers who could bring change to England. His early efforts to assert his independence and reform the kingdom were admirable, and he initially enjoyed the support of his people. However, his inability to manage the delicate balance of power within his court began to take a toll on his rule. The influence of his advisors, the growing discontent of the nobility, and the failure to address the grievances of the common folk all contributed to his eventual decline. Despite his youthful energy and ambition, Richard struggled to maintain control over his kingdom. He was constantly pulled in different directions by the competing interests of the nobles, the rising tensions with the common people, and the pressures of foreign conflicts. His failure to navigate these complexities, combined with his tendency to overreach in an attempt to consolidate power, led to his alienation from many key factions. Richard's inability to recognize and adapt to these shifting political dynamics ultimately led to his downfall. The lesson from Richard's reign is one of humility and adaptability. A ruler must understand the limits of their power and the importance of compromise. Overconfidence and the desire for unchecked authority can lead to downfall, as Richard II's story so tragically illustrates. His failure to listen to the concerns of both the nobility and the common people left him isolated and vulnerable. It is essential for any leader to maintain connections with their subjects and to remain flexible in the face of changing circumstances. Richard's reign serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of political wisdom, the ability to build alliances, and the need for leaders to remain connected to the people they govern. Despite his early promise, Richard's inability to balance the needs of his kingdom and maintain control over his court ultimately led to his downfall. His reign, though short-lived, offers invaluable lessons for future rulers about the importance of political savvy, humility, and the limits of power. The lasting impact of Richard's fall. Richard II's fall from power had long-lasting consequences, not only for the monarchy, but also for the political landscape of England. The events surrounding Richard's abdication and the rise of Henry IV marked a turning point in the history of the English monarchy. Richard's inability to maintain control over his court and his failure to manage the growing discontent among both the nobility and the common people set the stage for the political instability that would plague England for years to come. Following Richard's downfall, the political power dynamics in England shifted dramatically. Henry IV, who had been an exile and a rival to Richard, ascended the throne with the support of many of the nobles who had once been loyal to Richard. Bolingbroke's rise to power was seen as a legitimate reclaiming of the throne, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase in English history. Henry's reign was characterized by a deepening of the divide between the monarchy and the nobility, and the instability. Richard's fall also had an impact on the perception of the monarchy itself. The events of 1399 showed that a king's authority was not invincible, that power could be taken away by those who held influence in the court. The notion of the divine right of kings, which had long been central to the legitimacy of the monarchy, was now seriously undermined. Richard's abdication and the subsequent rise of Henry IV demonstrated that the monarchy's power could be challenged and overthrown by ambitious nobles with the time. Richard II's reign and his subsequent fall from power became a defining moment in the history of England. The events surrounding his deposition were a stark reminder of the fragility of power and the consequences of mismanaging one's relationships with both the elite and the common people. Richard's inability to effectively navigate the complex political landscape of his time led to the collapse of his reign, and his story became a cautionary tale for future rulers about the importance of maintaining balance. In the long term, Richard's fall set the stage for the Wars of the Roses, a series of conflicts that would engulf England in civil war for decades. The instability and factionalism that arose during Richard's reign would continue to shape English politics for generations. Henry IV's ascension, though it brought an end to Richard's reign, did not restore political stability. It only opened the door for further conflict, proving that Richard's inability to maintain power had far-reaching consequences. Richard II's legacy, a cautionary tale. The legacy of Richard II is a complex one. Though his reign ended in tragedy, his story provides crucial lessons in leadership, power, and the importance of maintaining relationships with both allies and adversaries. Richard's early promise as a king, his potential for reform, and his ambitious vision for England were overshadowed by his inability to effectively navigate the political landscape and his failure to maintain control over the nobles and the common people. Richard's reign, while marked by moments of promise, became a cautionary tale about the dangers of overreach and the fragility of political power. His attempt to consolidate power by sidelining the nobles and asserting absolute authority ultimately backfired, and his reign ended in a loss of support from those he needed most to maintain his throne. Richard's failure to build and maintain strategic alliances with key figures in his court and his lack of political acumen left him vulnerable to those who sought to. Furthermore, Richard's relationship with the common people and his handling of social unrest were central to his downfall. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, though ultimately suppressed, revealed the deep-seated anger and dissatisfaction of the lower classes with the monarchy. Richard's failure to address the underlying issues of social inequality and economic hardship led to the rebellion, and his weak response further eroded his credibility as a ruler. This failure to listen to the needs of the people left. One of the most significant aspects of Richard II's legacy is the way his downfall highlighted the shift in the balance of power between the monarchy and the nobility. Richard's reign marked a turning point in English politics, as the power of the monarchy began to wane and the influence of the nobility grew. The events surrounding Richard's abdication demonstrated that the monarchy's authority was no longer absolute, and that the support of the nobles was essential for a ruler to maintain power. Despite the tragedy of his reign, Richard II's story offers valuable lessons for future rulers. His failure to understand the importance of maintaining strong relationships with both his advisors and the general populace, his inability to balance the competing interests of different factions, and his overconfidence in his own abilities ultimately led to his downfall. The lesson from Richard's reign is clear. A ruler must be aware of the delicate balance of power, understand the needs of the people, and in the end, Richard's legacy is one of unfulfilled potential and lost opportunities. His reign serves as a reminder of the precarious nature of political power and the dangers of ignoring the complexities of governance. Richard II's downfall marked the end of an era and set the stage for a new chapter in England's history, one defined by conflict and political upheaval. His story remains a powerful reminder that the greatest threat to a ruler's authority often comes from within, and that the ability. Key takeaways from Richard's story. The fall of Richard II is a powerful reminder of the delicate nature of political power and the importance of a ruler's ability to navigate complex relationships within their court. Richard's reign, though marked by initial promise, was ultimately characterized by a series of political missteps that led to his downfall. As we reflect on Richard's story, several key lessons emerge that are critical for any leader seeking to maintain their power and authority. First and foremost, Richard's downfall illustrates the importance of political foresight and the need for a ruler to maintain control over the key factions within their kingdom. Richard's failure to build strong relationships with the nobility and to maintain their loyalty ultimately led to his loss of power. The lesson here is clear. A ruler must be aware of the political dynamics within their court and be able to navigate the complex web of interests that shape the kingdom. Another key takeaway from Richard's story is the importance of understanding the needs of the people. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 revealed the deep frustration of the lower classes, who were burdened by heavy taxes and social inequality. Richard's failure to address the grievances of the common people led to the revolt, and his weak response further eroded his legitimacy as a ruler. A leader must be attuned to the needs of their people and work to address their concerns before discontent turns into rebellion. Richard's relationship with his advisors and nobles also provides important lessons. While it is natural for a ruler to rely on trusted advisors, Richard's overdependence on them led to his eventual downfall. The king's inability to assert his authority and make independent decisions left him vulnerable to manipulation and control by those around him. A ruler must be able to balance the advice of others with their own judgment and ensure that they retain control over their kingdom's affairs. Finally, Richard's reign highlights the dangers of overreach and the failure to recognize the limits of one's power. Richard's attempts to centralize authority and bypass the traditional structures of government were met with resistance from both the nobles and the common people. His failure to maintain a delicate balance between his own authority and the traditional power structures ultimately led to his fall from grace. A ruler must be mindful of their limitations and avoid pushing too far in their efforts to. Final reflections. As we conclude the story of Richard II, it is clear that his reign, though brief, offers profound lessons in leadership, power, and the complexities of ruling a kingdom. Richard's downfall was not solely the result of his actions, but was also shaped by the political dynamics of his time, the actions of his nobles, and the deep-seated social unrest that existed in England. Ultimately, Richard's failure to balance these forces and his inability to secure lasting support from both his nobles and his people. Richard's reign serves as a powerful reminder that a ruler must constantly adapt to the changing political landscape. A leader who is out of touch with their kingdom's needs and the shifting tides of political power will find themselves vulnerable to rebellion, both from within their court and from the people they govern. Richard's attempts to centralize authority without fully understanding the consequences of these actions left him exposed, and his eventual downfall was the result of this failure. In examining Richard II's reign, we also see the consequences of neglecting the needs of the people. While the nobles played a significant role in shaping Richard's downfall, It was the Peasants' Revolt that highlighted the deep fractures within English society. Richard's failure to address the grievances of the common people and his weak response to their demands exposed the fragility of his rule. A ruler who ignores the suffering of their people risks losing their legitimacy and the support of those. Richard's story also illustrates the importance of maintaining control over one's advisors and the court. A ruler cannot afford to be a mere figurehead, controlled by the ambitions and interests of those around them. Richard's inability to assert his own authority and make independent decisions ultimately led to his loss of power. He became a puppet to the interests of the nobles, and this loss of control over his kingdom was one of the primary reasons for his downfall. In the end, Richard II's reign is a cautionary tale for any ruler. It reminds us that leadership is not about maintaining absolute control or asserting one's will at all costs, but about finding the balance between power, diplomacy, and the needs of the people. A ruler must be able to navigate complex political landscapes, maintain strong alliances, and understand when to compromise. Richard's failure to do so led to the erosion of his authority and the loss of his throne. Richard II's legacy, while tragic, provides important lessons for future rulers. His downfall reminds us that power is fragile and that a ruler's success depends on their ability to adapt, listen, and govern with wisdom and foresight. The collapse of Richard's reign serves as a powerful reminder of the consequences of political mismanagement and the importance of maintaining balance in all aspects of governance. Richard II's fall, a final reflection. The fall of Richard II serves as one of the most poignant and significant chapters in English history, offering timeless lessons about leadership, power, and the fragility of authority. Richard's reign, though filled with potential and early promise, ultimately ended in tragedy. His failure to manage both the political dynamics within his court and the needs of his people led to his downfall, and the lessons from his reign continue to resonate with those who seek to understand the complexities of leadership. Richard's story highlights the crucial importance of maintaining balance in power. Throughout his reign, Richard struggled with the conflicting pressures of his nobility, his advisors, and the common people. He was unable to forge lasting alliances with those who held power, both within his court and throughout the kingdom. As a result, he found himself increasingly isolated, without the support he needed to weather the challenges of governance. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, while a direct result of economic hardship, also exposed Richard's inability to connect with the common people. The revolt revealed the deep-seated resentment and frustration among the lower classes, and Richard's failure to address their grievances led to greater unrest. In the wake of the revolt, Richard did not take the opportunity to reform his policies or address the causes of discontent, which further eroded his authority. His response was weak and lacking in foresight, which foreshadowed his eventual failure to handle later crises. Perhaps the most significant lesson from Richard II's reign is the importance of adaptability and self-awareness for any ruler. Richard's inability to change course and respond to the shifting political landscape left him vulnerable to the ambitions of others, most notably Henry Bolingbroke. His failure to recognize the limits of his own power, combined with his inability to manage relationships within the court, made him an easy target for those who sought to replace him. Bolingbroke's return and his eventual usurpation of the throne exposed the fragility of Richard's rule and highlighted the consequences of political mismanagement. Richard's downfall also underscores the importance of maintaining the support of key factions within a kingdom, particularly the nobility and the common people. A ruler must be attuned to the needs and concerns of both the elite and the broader population, ensuring that their leadership is both responsive and inclusive. Richard's failure to balance these interests ultimately led to his loss of power and the collapse of his reign. The legacy of Richard II's reign is one of unfulfilled promise, a stark reminder of the complexities of leadership and the importance of maintaining a delicate balance of power, authority, and influence. His tragic end serves as a cautionary tale for future rulers, demonstrating that even the most promising of leaders can fall when they fail to listen, adapt, and navigate the complex forces at play in their kingdoms. Richard's downfall was not only a personal tragedy, but a defining moment in the history of England, one that set the stage